Welcome to an In Conversation with Debbie Carroll from Step Change Design. My name is Emma Smith. I'm the project manager with Empowered Conversations, and that's a project of Age UK Salford.
Lovely. So, hi everybody. My name's Debbie Carroll. I'm a garden designer and I run Step Change Design. And with a fellow designer, Mark Rendell, back in 2013, we did what was intended to be a small research project to understand why care home gardens were not more actively used, and in particular for people living with dementia. And even for gardens where they had been previously designed and fallen out of use. And in fact, I was actually asked to redesign 3 care home gardens that had been designed before and fallen out of use. And they felt by me redesigning them, that would make the difference. And so Mark and I thought that there was some design aspect that was missing in the research. We could see a lot of wasted money, a wasted resource, and a wasted opportunity of residents living in care homes actually even being able to continue to step outside easily. So our research accidentally, because of a link with Napa, became a huge project that we self-funded, and we worked with 24 care homes across England and Wales with vast amounts of data. And it took us way away from design and where we thought the answer lay, to actually the key findings that you can see on the screen now, which are, as you'll see, very focused around the people. Fortunately, we did find a role for designers, which I'll come to. So why aren't care home gardens more actively used? The overarching finding is that there is a correlation between advanced care practices, so what gets referred to as person-centred or relationship-centred care, and truly active engagement outside, regardless of the appearance or the design or the time of year of your garden. This was really because those care settings that are truly person-centred are focusing their care around supporting residents individually to live the life they would choose and to engage as and when they wished outside. And so they were making this happen through the way their care wraps around that individual. What we also identified was that for care settings that have a fearful attitude to health and safety, or who are blaming the garden as a perhaps perceived dangerous space, this effectively caps engagement outside. And this really does have to be overcome, and a more positive risk versus benefits approach put in place. For that to happen, a care setting does need to know their resident well. And so actually that is another driver towards a good reason to be fully person-centred. I have to say, for all of these findings, I'm mentioning care settings because that's where we did our study in predominantly dementia care homes. But all of our findings we found translates to the home and domestic garden as well, where carers are looking after somebody with dementia or with other frailties as well. For much of our study, we were puzzled as to what this meant for us as garden designers. But it eventually did come to light, and we were able to clarify that what had been going on was that garden designers, we go in with the best of intention to create great gardens, and very often we do create lovely gardens. But the reason that they were not going on to be used was that in effect we were designing them potentially beyond the capabilities of some care settings that perhaps were not yet at person-centred. And so we identified that our design support needs to take account of the organisation and the people involved. And we need to match where they are now and come alongside them in a journey to improved care practices. And so it's not about no design, it's actually about delivering that design in a different and often smaller and staged way that supports improved care practice as well. So Mark and I are visual creatures, and we thought rather than an academic paper, we'd create a tool to help share this. And we've written 2 books as well in a series called Why Don't We Go Into the Garden? One book is for care settings and people in care roles, and helps with that culture change towards improved care practice. And one is aimed at garden designers to help understand how they can support and deliver their design support more appropriately. And so the key tool that we created was something we call the care culture map, because the whole of our research showed us that there's actually a spectrum of care. So if you can see the yellow arrow on the right-hand side going up the side of this tool. It looks complicated, but it's like any map, you're on it somewhere. And we saw there was a spectrum of the way care was delivered. And this can be the same in a domestic home as well as in a care environment. So if you imagine towards the bottom of this map, the doors are firmly locked and the garden's not truly engaged with. In fact, it may as well not exist. And then gradually we move forward into the kind of care that's very task orientated, perhaps quite medical model is a phrase that you might hear. And at this point, you might see that the garden is used perhaps on very nice days, quite generically as a group activity. And gradually, as we move towards person-centered and as we get to know the person that's being cared for better as an individual, once we reach person-centered, then more spontaneous and individual and meaningful care is happening inside and outside the home. And through into relationship-centered care, which is that little bit further up, this is how it can look in a family type environment where it's actually quite blurred. Who's the carer versus who's being cared for? It's a reciprocal thing. There is something to be gained by both parties in enjoying time outside and together. And person-centred on our map is where the Care Quality Commission is looking for care homes to achieve. And this was the point where we saw that active engagement will happen more naturally in our work. What was fascinating for us, we were garden designers, we knew nothing about care, was that throughout the whole of our study threw at us lots of contrasts and contradictions that helped us see that spectrum. So we had one care home that withdrew very early in our study because of a few wonky paving slabs. When we inquired as to whether they were going to get them fixed, they didn't think that they would for the entire summer, which was a bit of a shame because it was a nice summer that year. So they withdrew from the study. In contrast, another home that we went on to relate to being relationship-centred in the way they delivered care, we accidentally literally unearthed, a mine shaft in their dementia care garden. This had been very badly covered over by an unscrupulous contractor, and they didn't know it was here. We accidentally uncovered it, and actually I was very lucky not to lose Mark down it. The key thing from this was that this, with the very unusual sized manhole, this was not a standard size, they had this fixed in 24 hours. Now you might think, well, it's pretty dangerous, do you want to get that fixed pretty quickly? But actually the driver for them fixing it wasn't this big hole in the garden. The driver was the fact that for residents, he spent all day, every day outside in the garden, and it was essential to meet wall needs. And in doing so, this had to be fixed because clearly he couldn't go in the garden with a mine shaft. The driver in this home was not the health and safety risk here. The driver was what care needs and his wish to live a fulfilled life, which he spent outside tidying and cleaning and in his own shed in this particular care garden. This next set of sort of stories, if you like, also illuminate those same contrasts, but they also underline a different way in which health and safety was interpreted, and they helped us to work out how along that care spectrum health and safety is applied in different ways. So in the top left-hand image is a garden that I designed, for which there was meant to be a wash line because the residents wished to have it. This was actually dismissed and never installed. In this instance, actually, the trustee thought it would look untidy and clutter up the space. In the larger central image, if you look right, tucked into the corner is a rotary wash line tucked in the corner. I called this area affectionately an activity graveyard. This was a garden that had been designed with all sorts of elements in by some other designer, and over a period of time, as various accidents or incidents happened, each item was stripped out. When we inquired about the rotary wash line and why it wasn't being used, it was simply stated that it's a ligature risk. But this was a generic interpretation applied to all residents, regardless of ability to use them. So in this particular home, the things were being assessed for their risk. In the top right image, it was a home that was in our study, and we loaned them a wash line for this windy site because they were struggling to see how they could use it. And they went on to try a few experiments with a few of their residents to see whether it would be meaningful and useful. And in fact, the lady on the right, it went on be identified that this was a really enjoyable activity for her. She loved to wash and hang the laundry. And so this became a regular activity for her. In this particular home, they started to know more about their residents and were starting to understand who could use the wash line versus who couldn't. But probably the most special example in this instance around wash lines was in the bottom image. In this particular home, it was actually extremely bland garden, but this was a very actively used garden space. And they had identified with one particular resident who kept looking out the windows but wouldn't be persuaded to go outside. That actually, as they got to know her, they learnt that her husband was the gardener. Her children loved to play in the garden. And she was always so busy, the only reason she would have used the garden was to hang the washing. This home had her doing the real washing for the care home. It was one of her jobs as part of the home to hang the washing. Very often it was tablecloths and tea towels. In this instance, on this particular day, it was somebody's laundry. She would be in and out all day long in this northern home where the weather was quite changeable, popping the washing out, bringing it in because it was going to rain, popping it back out because it was brighter again. What was interesting in this home was how this had evolved. Not only did she live with a dementia, but they also noticed she was beginning to get frailer and struggling with the overhead line. So they then popped an airer up, and just out of the shot in this photo is a chair so she could take a seat. And so they were also alive to the fact that her needs were changing, but they were looking for new ways to actually ensure she could meaningfully continue to do this activity she loved. And so in this particular home, there was this deep knowledge of their resident, of both what they liked to do, what they loved, what they disliked, but also of their changing and ever evolving needs, physically and mentally as well. They were very much risk assessing the resident. And in this same home, we asked about ligature risk. And it was very, very clear in this home that they understood for which residents a wash line might be a problem. And the resident was supported to mitigate those risks rather than the thing removed and detract from somebody else having meaningful engagement. Now, that will be appropriate in different ways in different homes. The important thing was that in this home, they were very much assessing the resident and their capabilities and how to mitigate and ensure that these things could be used safely so that an activity could continue. They were balancing risk versus benefit, which is quite different from those earlier examples. So how do we get outside more? What's getting in the way of getting outside? And what hints and tips can I give you for making that happen, whether you're in a care environment or whether you're in a domestic home? The first area I'd say is take a look at your doors and your windows. So often in many homes, possibly the doors are locked or complicated. The signs that I've got on this slide with the push bar is actually a door that could be used to the garden and was open, but it had so much signage on it, even I was scared to use it, thinking that it wasn't actually suitable or okay to use it. Are routes clear to doors? Can people get out easily? And even in the domestic setting where you may have had the same layout for a very long time, is it wide enough? Does somebody now need an arm? Do I actually need to do a little bit of a rearrange? It might not need much, just to make that an easy journey. And can people see out of windows? For those people living with a dementia, the garden needs to exist. If you're going to make an invite to take somebody outside, you're more likely to get a positive if they can see the garden, rather than it sound like some alien space. You may also want to think about, what do people want to do out there? Do they need coats? Are they readily to hand? Are they near the door, or is the moment going to be lost by the time you've been and got them from the other end of the house? What activities do people love to do in the garden? What are their joys? And it might be as simple as bringing those things closer, moving a bird feeder or bird bath, bringing a favourite pot to water, whatever that activity is that people have a joy in, moving a chair or a bench closer, so that actually that initial activity of stepping out can be engaged with quickly. Once out, very often things unfold quite quickly, but it is that transition at that threshold where a lot can be done. And we often say for care settings, you may want to do a sort of door and window audit, both upstairs and down. Can people see out easily, and can they get out easily? And if people have frailties or mobility issues, it is the one area where physically the design at the threshold to get out needs to be simple and easy. And it could be as simple as moving things so that it's a nice, clear route. It may not need complicated things. And also, don't forget the simplest of activities. A garden doesn't have to be about gardening, as much as that is often what springs to mind. It could be about stepping outside for a breath of fresh air, for a bit of a walk on a cold and blustery day to blow the cobwebs away and to come in for a warming drink, or even actually just to take a drink outside or your lunch on a nicer day if you can find somewhere sheltered. So, don't overcomplicate it, I would say. Very often from the simple activity, other things will unfold. Over the years, Mark and I have both designed quite a few various care environments and care settings for care homes and hospitals of all sorts of ranges, and also domestic gardens as well. And very often for people living with a dementia, the familiar and domestic scale can feel more comfortable. So very often that is what you'll see in some of our designs. But equally, we also need to make sure we've unpicked why we weren't already going outside. And so we quite often presented with a wish list. And Mark and I have a habit of trying the doors to see if they're open or locked. And we were presented in one particular care home a wish list with about £20,000 to £30,000 worth of items on it that they felt that would make this garden more actively used. It was already a secure garden, but the doors were locked. Eventually, we unpicked as to why the doors were not open into this secure space. And they explained that actually they're a bit worried about the step just outside the door, that it needed a handrail. We looked at the wish list. Yeah, and guess what's not on the wish list? The handrail. So this garden was destined to spend a considerable amount of money, and yet the main reason why it currently couldn't be used had not been addressed. And what's fascinating to us is quite often when these issues are addressed, the wish list changes, is often simplified, and may not cost as much, or may be simpler to implement in stages as well. We may well have gone on to do the £20,000 or £30,000 worth of investment for that home. But if you don't address the key reason for not going out already, that could be wasted money quite quickly once the novelty of the new space has worn off. We're also often asked, is there one item that can make a garden actively used? Mark and I set out on our study actually thinking that might be the case, hence why we loaned some items to care homes to trial. As you saw from our findings, that actually isn't necessarily the case. It's people that drive activity outside. However, we did look at what items people engaged with during our study. And during the course of our study, we saw engagement with 304 different items. No one of them really jumped off the page, other than people, actually. People, and seats, plenty of benches and places to sit. There were some other key findings as well, which are on our little infographic. So, for example, if you take food or drink outside, people will tend to stay 80% longer. So, if you were planning to have a meal or a drink inside anyway, why not plan to take it outside and enjoy a bit of fresh air as well? In terms of if you're thinking about adding something to a garden, a new element, a new feature, or even a new activity, there is a danger, particularly for people with dementia, to get carried away with the latest internet fad. And there's quite a few of them about sometimes. So Mark and I, within our resources, created a checklist tool that helps to sense check whether something would be appropriate or not. And it works around 4 simple questions. Would the item be purposeful, realistic and in context, meaningful and relevant for that individual or groups of residents? And actually, is there an opportunity for spin-off activities for others, or for linking to the wider community, which we call sequencing? So the checklist is actually within one of our publications, but it's also available within an article we wrote for NAPA in spring 2015, and can be found on our download page at the website link that's on the screen now, which I think you can look back on later. We have actually written loads of articles for I don't know how many magazines. I did lay them all out, as you can see in the image. And so all of those downloads are available as well on a whole range of areas of our research. So you can read more for free about what we found, what that means for both care environments, for people living with dementia, and for designers and outside specialists who support care environments. So the key really for making a garden actively used is about keeping it meaningful, and that means knowing the person. So in a care setting, that is about knowing your residents and learning as much about them, their likes, their dislikes, as well as their medical capabilities as well, both physical and cognitive. But that applies in a home setting too. And even in a domestic setting, other people start to come into the environment if people have various frailties. So you might have occupational therapists and other specialists come in too. Take care, because they bring their myths and beliefs about the outside space. And one of the best ways to actually understand how people like to engage outside is to step outside. Some information about people's ways of connecting outside only come to light by being in the outdoors. It's quite common for care homes to actually want to gather life history before people join a care home. Ideally, this is not a one-off incident. They should carry on doing that throughout the time that a resident is there, wanting to learn more and more. But we actively encourage, if you're thinking about moving into a care setting, to make sure that some of that life story is captured while in the outdoors. So, for example, the picture on the right is a city garden. It has a very strange layout. It's quite tree covered and surrounded by tower blocks. 2 instances of conversations with a resident with dementia. She mentioned that she wanted a swimming pool in this garden. This garden was the least likely garden for having a swimming pool. It really would never have worked. And she mentioned this to 2 different carers, but it took our diary recording to notice the commonality that this had cropped up twice. So we flagged it back to the care home. They then, to their credit, did a bit of digging to discover that actually on a sunny day, she would go to the local swimming baths around the corner. The care home then did some risk assessing and re-enabled her to do that on a routine basis. There was no way this garden would have ever suited a swimming pool. But the fact that a nice day when out in this garden prompted that conversation, that was never going to occur on the inside. Likewise, a gentleman farmer that had been in a care home for 18 months, and this was a home that hadn't used their garden much. I sat in the garden having tea with him after we had redesigned the garden and pointed out this pig. And Mark got chatting to him too, and we knew he was a farmer. A whole range of additional stories around being a pig breeder, around his father being injured from a cow. All sorts of things came to light that the care home later told us they had no idea about. And yet they felt they knew this gentleman quite well, and he had been with them some time. And it was being in that outside space that brought these things to light. So if you want to enrich your knowledge of what people might want to do in the garden, sometimes you do have to actually just simply cross the threshold. So I've covered quite a lot of ground, and I'm sure a lot of the things can be translated to a domestic setting as well as within care environments. Just going to share with you a screen with some resources on, and I'm conscious that you may want to come back to this at a later point. And then I want to finish with one last slide to leave an invite with you. And then I think Emma's got a list of questions that I may not have covered for me. So there's a whole lot of resources on our download page. They are all free. We also have written 2 books, like I say, for the care sector and for the design sector that include self-help tools to help unlock why you may not be using a garden already and how to support any changes going forward, both in your practices if you're a care environment or in the way you support design if you're a designer. We also do consultations and design support too, but very much focus around using what you already have as our starting point before building on to other things if needed. So there's lots of resources. We're also on various social medias, and we're always interested to hear what you've been up to in the garden as well through those. But I want to leave you with probably the key slide of all of our work, really. This is where we began. This was the question Mark and I had. Why don't we go into the garden? What's going on? What is it that's stopping us going outside? Why, if we've created these beautiful new gardens, are they not used and then they fall out of use again? And it had us thinking as we unpicked the answers, how do we measure success of our work? Well, actually, we measure success through the same question. If we start to hear this question as an invite in care settings, inviting residents to go out and say, why don't we go in the garden? Then that's the measure of our success. Because what we want to see is that a good day doesn't go to waste, whatever time of year or the weather outside. I hope you've enjoyed my quite quick summary of our research and our findings. I have stories galore. I've covered just a few of them, and I have a suspicion that perhaps from some questions that might follow, there may be a few more to come. But thank you.
Oh, Debbie, that was absolutely fantastic. Thank you. I feel massively motivated. I feel like I want to go into my own back garden, which is a bit of a bog at the moment, and start doing some work. If you have any questions for Debbie, write them down now. Whack them in the little speech mark with the question mark in the middle, and I will pick them up at the end. But in the meantime, Debbie, there's so much research gone into this. Do you think there's anything else that you're going to do from a research perspective?
Well, Mark and I were accidental researchers. So, we were very much garden designers, and we didn't really intend to do a research project, certainly not on the scale that we did. It was meant to be small with 6 care homes, and we ended up with 1,500 pieces of data. We quickly realized we needed a tool to help people understand it rather than an academic paper. The tool that we then realized needed some additional support. And so we have a lovely handbook that helps people explore several themes, which are really common, like overcoming the weather. It's a common excuse. And actually you can go out in all weathers. What was fascinating is in creating that handbook and using our own map tool, it illuminated more information to us. So the approach we did continued the research. It started to show us things that we hadn't realized we'd accidentally captured. And so it was only last year that 2022, that we published the accompanying handbook for our designer colleagues, because that part of it continued to be illuminated. So I guess in a way we had one research project, but it continued to evolve and inform us. And actually, as we now use it with care homes and designers, it still continues to have a feedback loop. The nature of it tells us more. So I'm not sure that Mark and I will do another research project. We're accidental researchers, accidental authors, which has been amazing. It's been one of those things I never thought I would ever do. But now I very much I want to probably just spend the time making sure that by the time I might need a care home, nobody even thinks twice that it might be difficult to step over the threshold and continue to enjoy the garden the way you did throughout your life. That it is just another room. And so, yeah, I probably really just want to focus on helping to share those findings, that actually it's easier than we think sometimes to step outside.
Fantastic. I loved the examples that you gave around positively embracing risk. And I just wondered if you've got another one that you can bring to mind of a care home where maybe they just went above and beyond for an individual.
Yes, there are so many. I'm trying to think. The wash line areas are really quite good. Yes, there was a home where we went to where there was a pond with a really rickety trellis around it as a fence. And it wasn't that high, it was sort of knee high. With my designer hat on, I asked the question, aren't you worried about the risk around this? And the care home the manager said to me, quite almost felt to me with my designer hat on, quite flippant, and said, the miracle would be if they could get over it. And they love to sit by it. And over the course of our 3 visits, we witnessed 2 ladies particular who sat on a bench and watched the fish. There was a little fish in it, and listened to the sound of a little bit of trickling water on it. And they would sit there. And where this bench was, they were slightly removed from the hubbub of a nearby very busy patio in this care home. And they didn't like to be in the mix quite so much. They liked to sit by this pond. And it took us the 3 visits to realise this home was risk assessing the residents. they knew which residents were safe to be sat by it unsupervised versus those that needed to be supervised, who tended to be more on this busy patio where it was supervised most of the time. And I'm not advocating an open pond in every care home. In homes that are lower on that spectrum, it would be positively dangerous. But actually what was fascinating, this was a high performing home, and they were risk assessing the residents to a degree where that pond was safe, as it was. If I'd been in there as a designer, my temptation initially would have been to think to cover it, put great big fences around it, or even fill it in. Mark and I have been on a journey where we have to think that as a designer, we come in with a approach that risk assesses the items as our norm in our sector. And yet CQC requires a care settings to risk assess based on benefit versus risk for individuals. And so we have to be very careful that we don't inadvertently take care settings backwards. If they are already high performing, we could have gone in there and brought back fears that they had successfully overcome with the way that they risk assessed, or that we could have actually removed an item that brought joy, like the example of the wash line removed. And so there is a disparity between the general thinking between the way design sector tends to, not in all cases, tends to deliver and deal with risk, and the way that the care settings are required to. And so some of our work now actually is about making sure the care setting remains in overall control of the final decision. I might now in that scenario, I would flag the risk, but want to understand how they do risk assessments to ensure that they are working at a level that can mitigate the risk at an individual level. It's not that the risk hasn't gone, but it's down to each setting. And so, yeah, an open pond had Mark and I thinking, oh my goodness, this is a nightmare. But that home showed us that actually in their hands, that was a positive thing. Another home that we went to, and actually the same week we went to that home, you would have thought that a teaspoon of water was a dangerous thing. And it was those contrasts and contradictions that were quite extreme. And Mark and I didn't have care backgrounds, so those things kept confusing us during the study. We would say, but we went to a home yesterday that couldn't do this, but you're doing it. What's going on? And that was the fascinating thing. So yeah, I mean, the pond is probably quite an extreme one. Like I say, I wouldn't advocate putting a pond in every home. It has to be a high performing home to be safe. But equally, a warning to designers not to immediately assume that that is unsafe until you've assessed how they are working with health and safety and the risk. Did that make sense?
Yeah, it made absolute sense. Thanks, Debbie. If we've got somebody, so maybe like a residential setting or a care setting, if somebody feels like their garden is failing, so then they're not able to get out and use it, what sort of simple steps could they take?
I guess a bit of what I sort of said earlier is, one, make sure you can get out easily. Often doorways are the first obstacle that people come across. One, from inside, can you get to it? And two, is the route from that threshold out okay? So sometimes if somebody's physical mobility is beginning to struggle, they might need a small ramp or a handrail, or just some clutter that traditionally might have been at the back door for years, moving out of the way. Sometimes people just need a bit more time as well at those doorways. It might not be as quick as it once was, and they do need an arm. But actually, in terms of getting out, it's working out what people love to do and how to continue that. So for each individual, that's different. If they love to garden, can they do that nearer the house than perhaps they might have done traditionally? It might be some pots and things nearby. Have the tools to hand, particularly for people with dementia. Sometimes it's grabbing the moment. They suddenly want to do something. You don't want to have to disappear to the end of the garden. My garden's sort of 200 foot long here. And the shed's at the bottom. If suddenly I needed a garden tool, by the time someone's gone and got it, you may well have forgotten that that's what you were intending to do. So bring a few of the common things to hand, have them perhaps in the kitchen or just by the back door, so that the things that you might want to do are ready to go in that moment. Simply having a coat to hand, not just for the person who wants to go out, but for the carer who's taking them. And if you have visitors to the home, if for some reason the carer perhaps, certainly in home settings, may have frailties of their own, if you've got visitors coming in, make use of visitors to help you take people out. So if it's difficult for you to help someone out, when someone comes, prime them to support you in enabling that visit as well. Grab an able body when they come through the door, because that might reassure you as the caregiver, to feel more comfortable. There was a research project done by Dementia Adventure and Natural England. I forget the title of it. I'll let you know afterwards, and then you can share it. But it stated that 80% of the carers felt that dementia got in the way of going outside, but only 20% of people living with a dementia felt the same. And so very often we forget, but quite often the carer may be elderly too, or have their own ailments. And so it may not even be about the dementia. And the person living with a dementia, but actually frailties for the person concerned, that they're worried about themselves having a fall. So, gather and garner support from friends and family and other visitors when they come through the door. If you're struggling to get out yourself, and help use them. Bring chairs and benches and tables near so that there's somewhere to sit. Have somewhere in the sun and somewhere in the shade. Our weather's variable, isn't it? So, we've got to grab it when we can. But yeah, even just having the back door open can make quite a difference to how people feel.
Oh yeah, just being able to hear and smell the garden it can give you an uplift, can't it? If somebody wanted to incorporate more sort of well-being elements, or wanted to make their garden more dementia or sensory friendly, what could they do?
Yeah, it's tricky, isn't it? So there's lots of these phrases bandied around. If you're living in a care home, or an environment like those sort of hospital environments, maybe they're quite sterile sometimes, or quite overly hot. But even from a domestic setting, the minute you cross the threshold, the outside is sensory. There is a whole host of different sights, sounds, the wind on your face, you feel the temperature, you feel the weather. So be aware that sensory as a garden, it already is, and think about what you might want to add. So what would your person you're caring for like? Would they like things they can touch? Would they like things they could potentially eat? Are they someone who's quite tactile? Have they got visual issues? So actually they might want something you can hear. But don't ignore the fact that many of these things already exist. And for some people living with a dementia, actually, sometimes some overstimulation can be too much. And so, if you have a garden and it's quite a noisy area, perhaps traffic noise and things, you may want to add some other sounds that distract from perhaps less appealing sounds, the sounds of plant leaves moving. And I always say be careful with water. Water's also used as water torture. For a reason. So if you use water features or anything like that, always have a manual on and off switch, because it isn't always pleasant for everybody, or at some point. So they might enjoy it one day and not the next. Always have an off switch. But think about sensory. The garden already is, and then probably focus on which of the senses that person might enjoy, or that perhaps is missing from your environment, before reaching to have every sense covered. You may already have many of them already covered. And in terms of well-being, the science has been around for decades, absolutely decades. Going outside is good for us all already. Just being out in daylight helps our sleep patterns and our mood. Some sunshine helps our vitamin D content, which helps our immune system. There's a whole range of things. Again, they don't need anything fancy. But improving nature, so having natural things in your garden, a simple lawn, or some wildflowers, some shrubs and some flowering plants, or productive items. Whatever floats your boat is the key thing, really. But natural is good, green as opposed to artificial turf and things like that. So, anything that brings wildlife to your door brings things of interest. And in terms of dementia friendly, probably the key learn for Mark and I is about being domestic and familiar. What would be familiar for your person living with a dementia? And that's back to that checklist that I mentioned, which can prevent you adding potentially gimmicks or infantilizing for people with dementia. And so, but knowing the person concerned, what would be domestic and familiar to them, and make it real. It's not pretend. It is real. If there's a garden tool, that's a real garden tool. It's not a plastic one. They may need support in using it, but keep it real, and keep it domestic and familiar. In terms of plants, the RHS has a great scheme of the AGM plants, which is Award of Garden Merit, which are good garden doers. They're things that thrive in many scenarios for most of us, whether you're green fingered or not. But the good thing about AGMs is actually many of them are plants that have been around for years. And so actually quite a lot of AGM plants are probably quite familiar plants to many of us, even if we don't know the names of them. The plant where you could point at it and go, oh, we had one of them in Granny's garden. They're good doers for a reason. So, if in doubt, have a look for the AGM award on a plant label at a nursery and see if it looks familiar. If it looks familiar to you, the chances are that it's been around a while and it will be familiar to the people that you're wanting to support. So yeah, there's no one big hit, I'm afraid. But that's a few little thoughts around the sensory well-being side of things and dementia friendly. A garden that works for everyone goes so far. A garden that works for the individual you're supporting will be the most beneficial. Very often the garden you already have is a good starting point to then add to and overcome any new problems that are being presented, which is often related to physical ailments more so than the dementia quite often.
So what I've heard from that is every garden should have a washing line.
Maybe. I've been to a care home where it's quite high end and the ladies and gents living there wouldn't have done their own washing.
Oh, well, fair enough.
So the meaningful thing, you do have to be careful. Or this day and age, people who are younger in care environments may be more familiar with the tumble dryer. Oh. So it is about that sort of understanding. The wash line's a great example, and generally speaking, it works quite well. But I think the key thing is don't assume. Each environment is quite different. One care home that I went to was for ladies and gents who had been missionaries and lived and worked abroad. So the home they chose was based around their faith group rather than a locality that any of them had traditionally lived in. And so actually what they brought back to that home was really diverse and not of that locality at all. It's very world aware in their background. And so it really showed the diversity of what might be meaningful for different people. We can't take for granted. In another home, they had lovely ornamental grasses that seemed to work and lots of the residents liked, but one resident wouldn't walk past a plant pot with a grass in it. To him, it was a weed. And for him, it was a generation where grasses were not an ornamental plant that he recognised. It was a weed and it shouldn't be there. It took some unpicking to understand why he didn't like it. But other residents who were not living with dementias recognised the grass as was an ornamental plant and part of the garden. So sometimes it takes some unpicking to understand why someone likes or dislikes something.
It's quite exciting, isn't it? You've got to start with knowing your individuals.
It's absolutely the key. Yeah. And in care environments, remaining ever curious Is a phrase that we like to use, because it doesn't just start with the life story when they arrive. It's about learning, and actually in a family environment at home, you meet up with a relative you haven't seen for a while, and you learn something new about them, and you're surprised, and you're like, oh, didn't know that about my cousin, or whatever. But we have to get away from life story work in care environments is a one-off exercise. We're always learning about each other, even with our best friends. Um, and so why should that be any different? And sometimes the outside can reveal things that nowhere else will ever do, that actually could be really beneficial for people and their quality of life into later years, both in the home environment and in a care environment.
Debbie, we're definitely in the same boat there around curiosity.
Yes.
Okay, so I've got a scenario. So say you've got someone who was really outdoorsy, proper gardener, and they've got to a point in life where they need to move into full-time residential care. What should people be looking out for in terms of finding the right place for them? What would be like obvious for you that that's going to be the right place?
Yeah, this is a tricky one. And I have one little, probably a good last story to share. Sue, our editor of our book, she sort of came out of semi-retirement to help us because she had recently lost her mother from a dementia. And Sue is an editor of garden-related books for many, many years. And she also at one time trained as a garden designer, and one of her college projects was to design a garden in a care home. So she thought she knew quite a lot about this area. So when her own mother needed a care home, she chose one locally with a nice garden. And Mark and I hear a lot of people choosing care homes with nice gardens. And I'm not saying you shouldn't choose one with a nice garden. But actually, even for Sue, it transpired that the only time her mum went in that garden was when Sue visited, and that this garden was not used. And that saddened Sue, because that wasn't her intent in why she chose this place. And it was sort of, in a way, sold to her with this beautiful garden. We have a lovely garden, but it was used rarely and really only activated by the relatives. And so I say to people, really, if outdoors is really important to your relative or to yourself, if you're choosing a care setting, one, make sure you try to continue to use the garden at home for as long as you can, even in small ways, because if you interrupt that too much, it's actually harder to pick it up when you do go into a care environment, because the carers are having to start from a point of stop. And then when you visit care homes, ask to see the garden, ask to go in it. You'll be interested at the doorway. Are the doors truly open, or are they fumbling around to find the key? Or is there a distraction of why you can't go out? Yeah, if this garden is truly open and truly accessible, it should not be complicated. I mean, it might have keypads and things to keep some people safe. Some environments need to do that because of their locality or their physical layout. A lot of our care homes across the UK are converted older houses, and the structure has not been designed for that from the outset. But is it quick and easily, is it facilitated? While you're at the home having visits, do you see people supported to go out if they wish? Ask to spend some time there, to see. Are people dressed for going out as if they expect they might? Or is everybody in their slippers all day? Are there people rattling doors to want to go out, but that's not supported? So I'd say try and spend some time there, but actually ask to go in the garden and see how complicated that is. If this seems challenging to them, that will be challenging for a resident as well. But if that is clearly easy and a normal part of their day, that's probably what will happen. And make sure that life story work early on includes a conversation about outside. It sometimes gets forgotten, and also we can forget. People will ask, well, what did your relative like to do? What was their job? What were their hobbies? But if someone has struggled to do something for a while in the home environment and it's stopped, it might get forgotten. Sometimes when you go into the right care environment, those activities can be picked up again because now there's the support to make it happen. So take care when asked those questions to remember the things that might have had to stop because it was difficult in the home environment, and that actually, how will the care home help you re-enable these things that have been important to the person but had to stop, perhaps because the carer at home was frail as well and struggling to facilitate that. So, you know, the best of homes re-enable things that were a joy to happen again. But they can really only work on information that they're given sometimes as well. And sometimes the garden and the outside world gets forgotten in the conversation or not specifically mentioned. They'll just say, what are the hobbies? And if they haven't gardened for a while, it might get forgotten. But it's good to just have in your head, have they mentioned the outside world? And what did you like to do in the outside world? Was it a daily walk, or, you know, whatever it may be? So yeah, but the doors are a good clue in my mind. You know, are they truly open, or where for some reason they do need to be shut, is it easily facilitated, both during a visit, but also if you're observing and watching other residents that are there. Be nosy would be my suggestion. And it isn't always the prettiest space. The two most active in our study had quite simple gardens, but they were used 365 days a year, as and when residents wished. And it was an ever-changing way in which they were used to support what people wanted to do there. So, you know, but equally I've seen brilliant gardens as well that are actively used. But don't rule it out just because it might be a bit bland. Key thing is ask the question. Spaces can evolve and change to suit individuals quite easily.
Okay, so I just wondered then, for my final question, if somebody is in a care home where they're not using the outdoor space, is there anything a family member could do to encourage that care home to sort of embrace that space?
Yeah, probably two things really. One, see if they can do it, sort of set the example of what's possible for your relative in that space. And then probably secondly, point them to some of our download resources and some of our findings and potentially this video, I guess. Yeah. You know, because actually quite often for homes that are struggling to get outside, they want to do it, and they have got wrapped up in some of the myths that abound. We are commonly told, well, of course we need more people, more time, more money, and a pretty space. Bizarrely, our research project unpicked all of those and in a way overcomes all of them. One of the homes in our study had a staffing problem during the project, and yet they were outside still. And we asked them how come, and they said, well, for residents who need to or want to go outside, they're easier to care for if we help them do it. And so it didn't stop just because they had a staffing problem. So it is possible for all homes. And yes, of course, you can do more if you've got more money and more stuff, great. But actually, it doesn't stop it happening in those that are on tighter budgets. So yeah, point them to our findings. The key elements of all our findings is available for free. There are obviously paid resources beyond that. But yeah, our aim is to advocate that anyone who wishes to go outside is able to do so freely as they've done all their life, with the right support to make that one safe but also meaningful and enjoyable too, with any of the ailments that they may be living with, you know, taken into account, but actually that they can continue to enjoy the outdoors and gain the benefits that there are from the outside. You know, Mother Nature is our ultimate first ever carer, so you know she's there waiting to help us all. Yeah, but I'd say have a go yourself, get outside, and then possibly point them to some of our resource, because they're probably wanting to know some answers, and if we can help unpick some of the problems they've got easily, some progress can be made quite quickly quite often.
Fantastic. Now, I'm sorry, we've got a few questions that have come in, and I thought I was going to get an alert, but I didn't. So, Jeff, your question is around any of the information discussed here. I will email you all the participants with all of the links so you have that. Manda's agreed with me. She definitely wants to get out into the garden. Karen has said, this is very quickly, Debbie, now. What 3 design items would you say a garden needs for person-centered care?
I'd probably skip the design item as number 1 and say people that are curious and willing to support the resident themselves. It's got to be the people first. And then after that, I'd probably say plenty of seating that's flexible for both small and larger groups, somewhere to sit and dine, somewhere to sit in sun or shade. But keep it flexible, keep it familiar. That would probably be my starting point. And beyond that, then it really needs to be about knowing your resident.
Oh, very succinct. Well done, Debbie. How have you found the personal attitude of the carers influencing the energy and enthusiasm of getting the people supported into the gardens?
Yeah, it varies. Many times people want to do it because most people, even if they're not gardeners themselves, recognize that going outside can be a nice thing. So most want to do it. Some sadly do get caught up in various myths and beliefs around why it's dangerous, not possible, needs lots of other things, when actually it may or may not need that. So yeah, there's often lots to unpick and quite subtle reasons that prevent people going outside. And for some people, they've not grown up with the outside being part of their own lives. So we're asking carers to engage in something that's unfamiliar to them personally. But in that case, quite often the resident may be the expert. That's fine. And it's being prepared to trust that the resident can take the lead while you support them with the arm that they might need. So yeah, most people know and want it to happen, but do get stuck around a variety of perceived reasons that prevent it. And it's helping unpick those in a positive way. And certainly all our tools aim to be a positive journey to improving engagement. We recognise that for some it's hard and that journey takes time. And you need, particularly in care environments, it needs to be a whole home approach. It's no good for it being one individual carer working in one way. That's too much for one. The most successful homes were where everyone felt activity and supporting continued life, quality of life was everybody's job.
Right, so we've gone over time. Apologies, everyone. That's terrible chairing from me. If we wanted to infuse somebody who isn't that into going into the garden, what can we do, Debbie? Very, very quickly, bullet points.
I hope that if they're in a caring role, their focus then is the joy of supporting their residents. And so remain curious about your residents, find the joy for the resident about going outside and get the joy from facilitating making that happen for them, even if the outside is not their joy.
Beautifully said. Thank you so much, Debbie, for your time, for sharing your work, your research and your enthusiasm. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.